All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? I want to welcome everyone for our legislative recap. Legislature adjourned in May, 1st of May, first part of May. And so this is just a little bit of a look back. We did this 2 years ago and just kind of did a little reflection on the legislative session once the dust kind of cleared and talked about some of the Montana Chamber's sort of wins and some of the things that we've got some more work to do on. And so we brought together a great group of folks that we partner with on a regular basis and helps us have a successful legislative session. I'm Todd O'Hare. I'm the president and CEO of the Montana Chamber of Commerce. This is being recorded, and then we'll stop the recording towards the end of kind of a little recap from each of us. And so if you have questions, that'd be a great time to ask questions, and you don't have to worry about it being recorded at that point. But I'm just going to kind of give a few sort of high-level points here as far as the activity of this legislative session. There were right close to 1,800 bills that were actually introduced in this session. Pretty close to half of those bills were passed. 884 bills were passed, and of the 1,759 bills that were introduced, the Montana Chamber of Commerce testified on. And so we either testified in support of or in opposition. I think it's probably safe to say that of the 1,759 bills that were introduced, some ayes from the Montana Chamber of Commerce were on every one of those bills, determining whether or not it was a bill that we wanted to engage in, whether we wanted to support, whether we wanted to fix, whether we wanted to oppose, whether we made the decision just to stay away from. So it was an active legislative session. We're not going to go over everything. We've got some big sort of items that we're going to touch briefly on, and then hope that we can get some questions and have a little discussion about some of the items that we covered. And you should feel free to ask on anything, whether we covered it or not. As we went into this legislative session, the Montana Chamber had identified a handful of priorities. Some of them were big, kind of overarching sort of priorities. Some of them were a little more tailored and a little more specific. Preserving Medicaid access was a very specific sort of priority that we went into. We've made that our number one issue as we looked at its importance for workforce development and ensuring that in this climate where we have such a workforce shortage, that employers have every able-bodied, employable individual available to join their workforce. We also saw it as an issue relative to economic development, particularly in rural communities. So preserving Medicaid access was our number one priority. We also were looking for opportunities for tax reform, tax increment financing, generally housing, anything that would improve the speed of housing and the certainty around housing development, childcare, tort reform, which is another way of saying, anything that we could do to kind of tighten up legal access for attorneys to sue businesses. I don't want to say just in frivolous, but just to kind of tighten that up to give businesses a little bit more security from litigation for doing the best that they can. Energy is a broad subject, workforce development and entrepreneurship. And so that was a big, very diverse, broad ranging set of issues that we engaged in. And I would say that at the end of the day, I think we had a really good session. We were able to see some significant wins, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those. And again, our intent here is not to touch every one of those bullet points, but just kind of cover some high points. And with that, we'll start with Medicaid access. And Jesse was kind of the lead for us in working on Medicaid access as part of a big coalition. And so, Jesse, you want to give us a little snapshot of Medicaid access and how that turned out?
Absolutely. Thanks, Todd. Jesse Luther. I am a partner in the Taylor Luther Group here in Helena. Preserving Medicaid access was a very big deal this session. A little bit of history for folks that may not know. Medicaid expansion was originally passed in the 2015 legislature. It is called the HELP Act in the state of Montana. It was passed with a 5-year sunset at that point in time. And so in 2019, it was revisited. It was one of the biggest fights of that session, as it was in 2015. And there was another 5-year sunset put on in 2019. So we came back this past session. Sunset was supposed to be June 30, 2025. And we were seeking to remove the sunset in its entirety to ensure that the program continued to offer healthcare for low-income Montanans. Everyone expected this to be one of the biggest fights of the session, as it had been previously. But frankly, through the good work of the chamber and the partners in the healthcare industry, folks really put a lot of work into it headed into the session. And based on that, I think a lot of the legislators themselves knew that we likely had the votes to get it across the finish line. And I think a little bit, though, to all of our surprise, the bill kind of sailed through both chambers. It started in the House. Ed Buttrey was again the sponsor. It was House Bill 245, and the bill did some tweaks to the workforce enhancement provisions through the Department of Labor. But really what it did was it eliminated the sunset going forward. So it came through the House with over 70 votes, I believe. I didn't write that down. I should have in preparing. And was heard in the Senate early. As you know, there was some consternation amongst the Republican Party in the Senate this go around. And I think that really paved the way for this particular piece of legislation, given all the work that had gone into it on the front end. And the bill actually passed the Senate quickly and was signed into law by Governor Gianforte on March 27th. There were not any major revisions to it, so it remains some bolstering of the workforce and training components of the HELP Act, and there is now no longer a sunset on it. I think that was a little bit to everybody's surprise, but it was also one of those bills we expected to kind of get held hostage to be one of the big deal-making pieces at the end of session, and it shockingly was not. So I think a lot of the good work from folks in this room that went into it really helped pave the way for that. There were still several bills here and there trying to change eligibility requirements, adding additional workforce requirements, some other tweaks to the dials on the actual provisions in that piece of legislation, but none of those that would have materially harmed the program passed. There were a few tweaks that went on here and there, but I think those were all generally neutral or positive impact. So we hopefully won't have to take up the sunset issue again in the future, but this is something that the legislature will still review every 2 years, because the Appropriations Committee and the Finance and Claims Committee, they still have to do the analysis whether they're going to spend the money and affirmatively appropriate the money every 2 years. So it's still going to go through those review processes. A couple things I just want to highlight headed into the future on this. Montana has had on the books since 2019, some workforce requirements. Work requirements are called community engagement requirements. Those have never gone into effect because we have never gotten federal approval for those. But I think with the Trump administration in office and new leaders at CMS, they might take another run and submit a waiver to try to get those community engagement requirements enacted. So I think that's something to kind of be on the lookout for. But the data in Montana, I think, is very positive. I think 76% of Medicaid expansion enrollees are already working or in school full time. So that's out there. Another thing that's kind of top of mind is the big, beautiful bill at the federal level. That's got a lot of revisions to Medicaid in general. A new study that the Montana Healthcare Foundation came out with, that Manat did, has said that on a percentage basis, Montana stands to lose more federal funding than any other state in the country on Medicaid provisions that are in the bill right now. So I think that's something we're kind of going to be paying close attention to see if that bill passes at the federal level and what those impacts are. That study estimates 31,000 Montana Medicaid enrollees would lose coverage under the bill as it currently stands. And over the next 10 years, Montana could lose $5.4 billion in healthcare spending, which I think would have a pretty drastic impact on our rural hospitals in the state. So that's kind of Medicaid in a nutshell, and some things that we're looking forward on to ensure that we have a healthy workforce.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. And I think Medicaid expansion and this next topic of tax increment finance districts are two good examples of where the Montana Chamber uniquely could bring a business voice. Medicaid access had a lot of folks from the medical profession, not that they're businesses, they are businesses. We brought a little bit more of the Main Street, rural Montana sort of voice to that discussion. We did the same thing with tax increment finance districts. We saw in the 2023 legislative session a big attack on tax increment finance districts, which allows the redevelopment in downtown areas that have fallen in disrepair and need some basic sort of infrastructure to encourage investment from the business community to come into those areas. And it's one of the few economic development tools that communities have to try to incentivize, if you will, investment in downtown areas. And the business community in large part is big supporters of and invest in those downtown communities. And we've got lots of rural communities that we can point to that are success stories for tax increment finance districts. Some of the work that's being done today on 7th Avenue in Bozeman, and you think about Montana Avenue in Billings compared to the way those areas looked 20, 30 years ago and what they look like today. And there's a lot of benefit that comes as a result of tax increment finance districts. And so we went into this session bringing the business investment voice. The local government brought their voice into this thing. And ultimately, there was nothing of consequence, I would say, that passed the legislature that did damage to the ability to use tax increment finance districts in local communities. And so that's another one of those great examples where we kind of went in thinking this is going to be the fight of a session, Medicaid expansion and tax increment finance districts. And ultimately, we were successful on both, and they weren't sucking up near the amount of oxygen in the Capitol as we were expecting.
I don't want to downplay, though, that Medicaid had some really aggressive opposition.
Oh, it did.
And
and
there were bills taken after TIF too.
Right.
I know, I probably glossed all that over.
Yeah.
Interesting time, but no, the Senate floor debate on Medicaid expansion was kind of a knockdown, drag out, and
Right.
You had long-standing opponents to the program, argue based on their principles why folks should not vote for it. And we had a freshman legislator who was the floor carrier, and he did a fantastic job, but it's kind of hard when you're going up against your very first session ever, a floor debate against some folks that have been fighting this particular issue for a decade.
And I think too, right? I think it speaks to the fact both of these are great examples of, there was a lot of homework that was done by stakeholders, if you will, leading up to the session. The medical business sector and the Montana Chamber, on Medicaid expansion, we'd spent a lot of time working together, coordinating, doing our vote counts, figuring out where our respective lanes were so that we didn't, overlap each other, and we were all bringing a unique voice to it. Same with tax increment finance districts, is that we figured out where our lanes were, and we started working on both of these issues months and months in advance of the legislative session. And I think that helped smooth some things over as we got into the session. So childcare is one of those issues too that regularly comes up amongst our businesses and our members as a big contributing to a workforce challenge that we have in Montana. We know that the child care model has been broken after the 2020 COVID pandemic era. And prior to the 2023 session, this was an issue. It's increasingly got to be an issue of urgency. We've been really fortunate at the Montana Chamber that Sheridan came along in 2023 and has taken a real passion and a real interest in childcare issues. And frankly, we've gone on this topic from virtually nothing happening in the child care arena to now we're starting to move the needle. And we recognize this is a bit of a long game that we're going to have to play this for the long haul, making incremental movements on the childcare issue. And I'm proud to say that I think we made some incremental advancements on childcare in this legislative session. And so I'll let Sheridan give us a little quick recap on that.
Indeed. Yeah, so in 23, we did support a subsidy change right near the end of the session, and that was kind of our first foray into any testimony on the child care issue. And so spent a lot of time digging into it in the interim and what it looks like for Montana. And we didn't get any of the big goals we had, but we had a lot of really good conversations with it. And I think that points to moving the needle and getting the ball rolling on those discussions as we work towards incremental changes. As we talk about what we expected for this session, that was what we expected, knowing the makeup going into this. And so we had some rule changes that would have, there were some proposed rule changes that we did defeat right around transmittal that would have made it so the rules that the department had proposed in the interim wouldn't have gone into effect, and they talked to over 700 stakeholders in that process, and should have a chance to go into effect before legislators go in and statutorily change those, which is one level above rule there. And so we did defeat those, and those had some interesting provisions that would have put kids in harm's way with not having only background checks only once every 5 years, being able to smoke when kids aren't in the room, things like that. Then we want kids to be safe. We want quality care. Parents often say that even if there is care available, you want your employees to be present at work and not worrying about the safety of their kids. And so that's the chamber's perspective there. And so we did defeat those, and then made some progress on a large tax credit package that was Senate Bill 321, and that had just a straight child tax credit, as well as a child care worker tax credit to help incentivize that low wage industry, as well as a business dependent care tax credit. So if your employer was helping you pay for dependent care, whether that was your kids or your elderly parents in some way, it's pretty flexible. And so that one did make it through the Senate and 2 House appropriations. And so a lot of really good discussions on both the House and Senate floor. A pretty darn big fiscal note in the hopes that lots of people would have used it. And so that I think worked to our detriment in that case. But like I said, move in that conversation. There is a early childhood trust in House Bill 924, which has some other qualms of its own for other reasons. I'm not sure how else to put that, but there is an early childhood trust bill, but that has a huge fiscal note, and that has yet to be signed, as well as the other remaining bill is for as far as subsidies. So that's just putting money into the current system to support childcare workers. So childcare workers automatically get subsidy for their own kids' childcare, is also awaiting a signature for the governor, and we are not sure what will happen there, but we'll keep seeing. We pushed this recap into June in the hopes that we'd have some more answers by the time we got here, but they're not moving too quickly up there. And so, and then a couple of other workforce and educational credit things. We got some career technical student organization or career tech ed funding for middle schools, as well as kids get educational credit if they are volunteering in nursing homes or long-term care or childcare facilities, which fit more into our workforce pillar, but really fit nicely, particularly with family and career, family and consumer sciences classes. So like Todd said, moving the needle forward, but we got work to do.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is a great example of, within a couple of years period of time, this issue around childcare was a non-starter in this legislative body. And now we're seeing some of the proposals that we support and are leading on are making it through one chamber, which is a significant advancement. And so, again, we're playing the long game on this. We're making some incremental advancements on it. Sheridan's already working on the next legislative session. We had a conference last week with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Helena, and continuing to educate the general public and voters and business leaders about childcare and some of the options and some of the solutions that we're going to have to explore as we go forward to address an issue that's not going to go away in the state. This workforce issue is going to continue to be a significant pinch point just based upon the demographics of our state.
And we heard often on House and Senate floors that on these bills and others, that businesses should be fixing this problem on their own.
Right.
It's not for lack of trying. That was our event last week, focusing on the business side of it. But
yeah, so I think there's some good things that are happening here, and so thank you, Sheridan. I mean, like I said, this is a great example where we've expanded the size of our footprint and the number of issues that we're tracking and we're engaging in the legislative session. So next we'll turn to tort reform. This is one of those issues that Governor Gianforte has really relied on the chamber to lead in the tort reform measure so that he can focus his energy on some of the other sort of legislative topics. And they have really appreciated the work that we've done in tort reform. And so Charles leads that sort of an effort, and we had a number of big bills related to tort reform that affect, most businesses, and at a minimum affects insurance rates. And so, so we tackled a number of these big issues. This is going to be one of those sort of topics that will be perpetual. Every legislative session, I expect that we'll be taking another bite at the tort reform apple, trying to see if we can continue to advance the ball and move the needle to make Montana's business climate as it relates to a legal environment, more certain, greater surety for the business community, and reduce some of those litigation sort of exposures. And so, Charles, you want to walk us through a couple of the big wins that we had on tort?
You bet, Todd. And I like your emphasis on the business legal climate, because that's what we're doing is trying to make things easier to do business here. And then also we had a lot of misguided bills that we were able to knock down. But I think the fact that those misguided bills made it as far as they did, up to the point of we just recently worked closely with the governor's office to request, and he went ahead and vetoed a bill, and that was something that had some aspects to it that would have made it more difficult for Montanans to access certain healthcare by participating in clinical research studies. And in fact, would have made that unavailable to Montanans as long as the law was in effect. And we were successful in working with the governor to ask for that to be vetoed. A number of other bills that we were able to, it took a lot of effort to convince legislators to ultimately vote no. And so I think, and the challenge of passing the bills we did pass, that speaks to the fact that there is a definite or a strong and noticeable warm welcome in the legislature for ideas that make life harder for business, and that just explaining that it makes life difficult for business, makes it hard for established companies and startup companies, is not enough of an argument. It's a big lift, and I do want to talk about a couple successes. But first, I want to just talk about the team that gets this done, because so Todd's up in the Capitol most days during the session. Sheridan and I are both in the Capitol most days during the session, and then we also have a chunk of our contract lobbying team, Steve and Brian C. Wade and Brian Thompson with Brown and Kalzak, Berry and Hoven law firm. Carrie Hagerberg was part of the contract lobbying team. Kevin Wade, part of the contract lobbying team, and so we had Caitlin Wenzel as well, providing a lot of strong support. And so we had an aggressive chamber presence in every corner of the Capitol. Along with that, we've got folks here that are part of our business caucus. I know a lot of people joined the call. Some of you are also part of our business caucus that representing different business interests, meets every Monday during the session. So these wins, and half of the wins are just knocking down bad ideas, really leans on this team pretty heavily. So I've just filibustered a lot because we lost 3 bills we thought we really should have won. One of them was a bill we proposed. 2 of them were bills that Representative Anthony Castro brought without asking us, but we thought were great ideas. We jumped behind them. A 4th bill that we knew would be a fight, but we got kind of backed into a corner and had to just pull the plug on that. So not as many of these, not as many opportunities to wave the flag here. We did have a couple of important successes, though, in third-party litigation financing, which is where foreign countries and sovereign wealth funds and hedge funds here in the U.S. Invest money in lawsuits. They're not suing a company because they've been wrong, because there's a breach of contract. They are just putting money up, going to law firms saying, well, what do you think is a good case? We want to get behind it. We want to help you recruit plaintiffs for these big class actions, and we want to fund the whole thing and then take a big slice of the plaintiff's recoveries. And sometimes that's up to 40 or 50% of the plaintiff's recoveries. So you can see this is bad for consumers because people are legitimately injured, are having a big chunk of their recovery diverted. And that's not attorney's fees. That's apart from attorney's fees. So you end up with people legitimately injured that have a very small recovery because of these lawsuit investors. But also, this investing in lawsuits is being used, especially by foreign actors, foreign adversaries, to expand the field of battle against U.S. companies, to gain access to proprietary information that otherwise they wouldn't be entitled to. And in fact, there's a big discussion. I think our congressional delegation is supportive of addressing some tax code advantages that are available for litigation investing. Because if you put money in to back a lawsuit, the plaintiff's recovery is ordinary income, but the investors are paying only capital gains tax rates, and foreign investors are paying nothing because their capital gains are untaxed. So there's an effort in Congress to change that tax incentive so that the incentives remain for legitimate investing behind real businesses, but are not being misused by litigation financing. And in Montana, we had made a lot of progress in 2023 on litigation financing. We capped, we told these investors you can't charge more than the usury rate of interest that is in state code. You can't take more than 25% of a plaintiff's recovery. You have to disclose that you're in this case because the parties have to disclose. So the investors also have to disclose. And then we came back in 2025 and we prohibited foreign adversaries, countries like Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, and companies headquartered there, domiciled there, prohibited them from engaging in lawsuit investing in Montana, and also created new transparency requirements for even foreign allies that want to partake in this kind of investing. So not an outright prohibition, because certainly people are allowed to fund their lawsuits, and then courts have their own oversight over that, but really putting sideboards on this practice. And Montana has now, I think, and been recognized as the model statute that other states should look toward adopting, because of the way we protect consumers and also limit this abusive practice. And then the taking on abusive lawsuits, we have been watching over recent years that the use of nuisance law, which is normally viewed as ways to address large-scale pollution that pollutes neighboring land, or to address things like an overgrown vacant lot or burning tires in the city limits. Those are considered public nuisances. And if it's your neighbor and your own property, sometimes it's a private nuisance. But nuisance law is to address those kinds of things where people are using their their land in a way that harms their neighbors and harms their community, and often it's associated with with pollution. But nuisance law has really been turned on its head by creative lawyers. Things like findings that firearms that function as designed and advertised are a public nuisance because of the way criminals use them. That plastic bags and plastic containers are a public nuisance because of the way that people are littering with them. That certain cars are a public nuisance because criminals are stealing them and consuming police resources. And this is never the intent of nuisance law. It's a really old form of law, addresses necessary concerns, and this has been an abusive practice. And so we worked with, again, Representative Anthony Castro on House Bill 791 and to bring Montana nuisance law back to original understandings. The Lieutenant Governor worked closely with us to fine tune the bill, and went through had a pretty smooth sailing in the House, challenges in the Senate, but we were able to get that bill maneuvered onto the floor and get it passed, and the governor signed it. So a win for Representative Castro. And I also want to just mention Senator Hertz, who had Senate Bill 511, the third-party litigation financing, a couple of strong partners for the chamber that are helping us with this business legal climate. And now we've got more work to do. We did have a number of bills, just to come back to this, where legislators, Republican and Democrat, were very comfortable making life difficult for business, imposing restrictions on online retailers that they just would be nearly impossible to meet. And so that was a big chunk of our effort, was pushing back on these sort of biotech-oriented bills and technology-oriented bills. And it took a lot of our collective energy to push back and to stop those bills. We were successful, but it's raising new flags of concern that issues we're going to have to watch out for in future sessions.
Great, thanks, Charles. And I think that's an important point, is that, as we went through this legislative session, there were times when, we were dependent upon a minority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats in order to pass or defeat a piece of legislation. And there were times that we were dependent upon a majority of Republicans in order to pass or defeat a piece of legislation. And so we've worked real hard as an organization to be able to work across the aisle, regardless of party. If you've got a good idea, we're going to work with you. If you've got an idea that needs to be fixed, we're going to try to work with you there as well. And if you have a bad idea, then sorry, but we're going to have to look for a different time to agree on something. One of the big issues coming into this legislative session, too, staying in the legal front, was the Supreme Court's decision on the Held versus the state of Montana. And that was kind of the big, broad, the state of Montana is violating our Constitution and our citizens' right to a clean and healthful environment. And it really upset a whole bunch of sort of longstanding law and process in Montana as it relates to state permitting. And so we got involved with that. Steve Wade led the effort on some bills to try to tighten up, which was a very broad sort of Supreme Court decision, which would have changed permitting going forward. And so, Steve, you want to touch on some of that work that you did there?
Yeah, as Todd said, it was expected after the Held decision that the legislature was going to have to do something. We really didn't know what we were going to have to do until we got that opinion. But a number of stakeholders, including DEQ, worked on a package of bills. There were 3 actual substantive MEPA bills that were drafted and introduced. All 3 of those passed and have been signed. I'm going to not get into the weeds too much, but then there were a couple other ones. Representative Oblander had one that was not MEPA related, but it had to do with the Air Quality Act. And it essentially made it so no local governments can be more stringent than the state, and the state can't be more stringent than the feds. And that gets to the whole issue of what's regulated and what's not regulated, so we don't have patchwork regulations. So everybody that's operating in Montana or looking to come to Montana, they know what the playbook is and what the rules are. So you have the 3 core MEPA bills. There was another one that also included some categorical exclusions that I think the Frontier Institute was primarily the lead on. That passed as well. A number of kind of other bits and pieces to MEPA, whether it's exempting Department of Commerce grants from MEPA analysis. And one of the reasons this stuff was so important is because some of that analysis is always so subjective that it's easy to tie projects up in litigation and have courts actually become the permitting entity. So I think those will be big wins. But then on top of that, just a week and a half ago, I think, the U.S. Supreme Court issued the 7 counties decision, and that has to do with NEPA. the National Environmental Policy Act. And interestingly enough, in that case, in NEPA, they say they look to NEPA for guidance, but in that 7 counties case, Judge Kavanaugh wrote the opinion, and it really kind of almost mimics the 3 NEPA bills that were passed by the Montana legislature, getting back to the core of what's procedural, that's not substantive, that it shouldn't be used as a roadblock. It really is a really good opinion for purposes of trying to get some sideboards on litigation with respect to those projects subject to NEPA. And I would expect then it'll give some ability to argue a little bit more in the Montana cases, even though Montana has its own constitutional provision. So that was a very good development, and we'll see how it goes. We also know on the federal level that they're trying to streamline some of the permitting, stuff like that. I think we just saw Signal Peak got their mine expansion approved, and so I'm sure that will be litigated. But all of those things are moving, I think, in the right direction for keeping Montana businesses open. And so you have that, and then you also have a couple of things like on the energy front where it seemed like it used to be everything used to have to deal with wind. This time had a little bit more of a solar flavor to it this session. You had revisions to the Solar and Wind Decommissioning Act. You have another bill that's still hanging out there on the governor's desk that has to do with community solar projects, which, given the size that's in the legislation, I have a tough time seeing how they're community sized. But they are very large projects that would put an extreme burden on the investor-owned utilities, as well as potentially make those utilities and their ratepayers subsidize the folks that use those or develop those community solar projects. That's sitting on the governor's desk right now. You also had the wildfire mitigation bill, and is what that did was limit. I wouldn't say limited the liability, but made it more clear that you actually have to prove that the utility or co-op did something wrong. And instead of there being strict liability, it kind of changed that to make it a little bit clearer that if you're going to sue and a wildfire starts, that's the utility breached its duty. Also put some other things in there about fire mitigation plans. They all have to do that, submit it for public comment, periodically look at it. It does a number of different things, but the intent is, after watching California, Oregon, and Washington, all the utilities ultimately end up in bankruptcy because of wildfire litigation. There's an effort that was successful in Montana to try to put some sideboards on that. So hopefully that will help keep the utilities out of bankruptcy and protect the ratepayers. So there's a number of all kinds of little small things. They also did a number of revisions to some of the, especially coal permitting statutes. All of those passed and were signed, trying to clear up some of the stuff that's usually the subject of administrative and judicial challenges, and give the agencies a little bit more clarity on how to implement those. Those were all successful. And everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, most people will be thrilled to know that they can still use styrofoam when they go to their fast food place, because the bill, surprisingly, I don't think there's that many people who thought that bill would pass.
Right.
And that bill was to ban the use of styrofoam as single-use containers. And it ultimately passed and went to the governor, and the governor vetoed it. So I think that illustrates a little bit of the changing maybe populism in the Republican Party somewhat, because they used to just be kind of pro-business and let the market take care of everything. And now you have a little bit of, I guess, change in that. Although I'm not entirely sure how much of it's really change, or how much is it that there were just, it seemed like a session that had a lot more vote trading going on.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that I'd like to hear from other folks on, whether they experience that too, and really whether the defectors in the Republican Party in the Senate, the 9, whether that changed the dynamic because you didn't have the opportunity for a lot of the controversial debates so much. But
Yeah, great. Well, and there's a lot of issues that are in kind of that non-glamorous, very technical, very complicated sort of arena that the Montana Chamber engages in. And Charles pointed out to me, which I thought was really astute, was that when you come to like employment law and workers' compensation, those are a couple of those sort of issues that are really kind of our bread and butter sort of issues that affects every employer in the state of Montana. They're complicated, they're non-glamorous sort of issues, but what happens up here in the state capitol every other year can have dramatic impacts and can deeply affect all businesses in the workers' compensation rates that they pay and how you can deal with employees and those sort of issues. And so, Brian, you want to give us a real brief recap on that, because I think it is an important issue that we don't want to completely overlook, because this is a lot that every member in our network, sees the benefit of this sort of work.
Absolutely. The vast majority of businesses in the state of Montana, they pay workers' compensation rates and they have employees. And so laws that impact both of those things are a large footprint on the business community in the state of Montana. To touch on it briefly, there's a little good and a little bad from the perspective of the Montana Chamber and its members, I would say. Working in concert with our workers' compensation friends, the providers, there was a couple of different bills that are going to have potentially some impact on the workers' compensation system in the state of Montana. One of those is coverage for PTSD. It wasn't that long ago, a couple decades ago, that Montana had some of the highest workers' compensation rates in the country. Through some significant reform many decades ago, that rate has really lowered to a much more competitive market with the rest of the nation. And one of the major reforms that were undertaken at that time was to get rid of what's known as a mental claim. What the Montana legislature decided to do this year was to pull that back a little bit. And so there was a couple of different bills being proposed, mostly by various public unions, to provide coverage for post-traumatic stress disorder for employees that suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, at least having it claimed that was something that happened to them due to their employment. Multiple bills, like I said, one eventually did get through. It is pending right now on the governor's desk. It has not been acted upon. Last I checked, which I think was last night. And so it's sitting there and hanging out. I think many of the workers' compensation insurers in the state of Montana are concerned that could really open the doors to not just one class of employee being available to claim PTSD coverage, but all through claims of equal protection. So that's something that we really need to keep our eyes on. That was something that the chamber worked on and other groups worked on. Ultimately, that did go through the legislature. It is waiting to see final disposition. Another one that was worked upon was the treating physicians bill, expanding the class of people that can be considered a treating physician in the workers' compensation system, that being physical therapists, which had not been eligible to serve in that role under the Montana workers' compensation statutes. That was something that workers' comp insurers and the Montana Chamber worked to say that this is gonna create problems, not individually maybe, but in a holistic manner. This could increase some costs. This could cause some problems if an actual physician isn't working on this first, and then prescribing out physical therapy, which is something that happens all the time in the workers' compensation system. That was some of the bad. Some of the good is that we were able to pass a bill, notably Senate Bill 367, which makes it absolutely crystal clear in the Montana workers' compensation statutes that just because an employer-owned vehicle is involved doesn't necessarily mean that activity or an accident involving that had to do with a work only. If employees are taking their truck to their company truck to the grocery store on the way home and have an accident in that case, is that a private individual occurrence, or is that something they're doing for their employment? This bill, we were able to convince the legislature that this is something that could help save workers' compensation rates, that if somebody is involved in an accident due to their employment, that's workers' compensation. But if they're not, that should be a private activity that had nothing to do with their employment. And we were successful in getting that all the way through the process to the governor's office. Really briefly on the topic of employment in the state of Montana, I think the biggest thing we really were focused on were some of the E-Verify and verification bills that went through. There were a number that were introduced, and what the chamber did was really get behind, in our opinion, what was the best one. And that was House Bill 226 brought by Representative Courtney Sprunger. That bill provides some safe haven for employers if they use the E-Verify system, but it doesn't dictate anything beyond what federal law already requires. From our perspective, that was the best of both worlds. It gave employers a reason to do things, but it also didn't make it too onerous or restrictive for employers to really act as an immigration police across the country, which is something that I don't think employers should be tasked with doing. So that was some of the successes we had in the employment and workers' compensation field, as well as some of the challenges that we faced.
Yeah, and I think some of these issues that you see that are hot button issues on the national issue, you see some of these legislators bringing those into Montana and making the case for them. And there were a number of really punitive sort of measures that were brought forward that were aimed at employers hiring illegal immigrants. And we tried to side the best we could on the business side of this thing and say, it's like, we want to be reasonable. Employers want to follow the law. Let's not make it more onerous. Let's not make a national issue that may be a hot button issue in particularly the southern states. Is it really that big of an issue in Montana? And so there was a lot of really onerous sort of pieces of legislation that really were capturing some of those big national issues and bringing them into Montana. And so luckily, most of those kind of went away. So as we wrap through this thing, we ended with probably our big disappointment from this session. And so we're
Policy-wise.
policy-wise, correct. Yeah, not
the
Amy.
speaker.
That's right. That is right. It's our big policy disappointment. And the rest of these bills and issues that we went through, roughly, this is kind of in the order that they passed or failed too. It was Medicaid expansion was towards the front of the session, and the very tail end of the session was tax reform, or as it's being labeled by some as tax reform, and that's property tax. And we were heavily engaged in this from day one, and feel like at the end of the day, this was one of those sort of places that the business community really ended up in a difficult spot. And so to kind of give us a summation of where we ended up in taxes in Montana, particularly as it relates to the business community, I'm going to turn it over to Amy Grimales, who's also the former chair of the Montana Chamber of Commerce and was the leading voice that brought the strategic plan to the organization. So
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Hare. So I just want everybody to know, when you do one of these things, it's always great to be with such an awesome panel. Everyone had kind of what they were in charge of. Under mine, it said, sadly, we lost. So on that happy note, I guess I'll just kind of maybe take a quick step back, though. I mean, in Montana, we have a two-legged stool, not a three-legged stool. And everyone in this room, and I see so many familiar names on Zoom land. I mean, the reality is, I think that most people in business in Montana recognize we need to move to the three-legged stool and incorporate sales tax. And in fact, we already are using the sales tax. It's just on certain, commodities. And so I'll take a step back on income taxes. The governor, Governor Gianforte, said it was one of his top priorities to lower that income tax rate. He had Senate Bill 323 that was introduced. That bill died, and then the speaker introduced House Bill 337 that did pass, and it lowers the tax rate on income taxes. Interestingly, in 2 different years, it changes the number from 5.9 down to 5.65 in 2026, and then down to 5.45 in 2027. But for some people, it's going to raise their income taxes. And so I just, for all of those of you who pay income tax in Montana, call your accountant. The other thing that the chamber has always been interested in on behalf of our members was the business equipment tax. There was a bill that would have raised the current 1 million up to 3 million through machinations I won't get into. That bill did die. And then finally, the one that had got the name, sadly we lost, was the property tax bills. So, when we were looking at how many bills passed or were introduced, if you're looking at Todd's number of 1759 bills introduced, I mean, the number of bills that were generally revised taxes in the system, hundreds of those, right? And then how many of those actually made it through the process? When all of us started lobbying 20 plus years ago or more, there were a lot of bills in the tax committees. Okay, maybe not you, Charles. You're younger, Brian and Jesse. Okay, Mark. Okay,
Sure.
so basically, and Sharon is. All right. Okay, so basically, okay, me, Stephen, my friend. But we did not see all of that, and I know we've kind of sparred back and forth with legislators on the benefit of having these generally revises, and I'm privy to having used some of those bill titles myself in certain days. But because of that, these property tax bills, we always knew that the 2 big ones that we'll talk about at the end of today here is House Bill 231, which was a bill that came out of work, Todd, that as you intimated at the beginning of this topic, you've been working on for the entire interim after the 2023 session, and never once said, oh, the chamber's good on that. So, I think that the chamber and other businesses had to stand up and oppose those bills because of the way that they were shifting property taxes from one class to another. And the reality is, if you have 2 buckets and you don't want to use, and you want to lower the income tax bucket, and you don't want to add in the sales tax bucket, you're going to shift property taxes. And we went round and round on that. And at the end of the day, that's what House Bill 231 and Senate Bill 542 did in the waning hours of the legislative session. And so again, there's nobody better than Bob Story with the Montana Taxpayers Association. If you're not a member, you should be. If you're not a member of the chamber, you should be. And it's a really complicated system that we now have in front of us. I have the most paper at the table because I had to go back. I think I blocked what happened out at the last few days because it was really confusing. Happened in a conference committee, as it tends to do these last few sessions. Arguably, there was public testimony. I'd say it had a minimal impact on the end result at those conference committees, but the voices were heard loud and clear that in 2026, and Bob Story did a great chart that's out there that explains, you really start looking at your taxes under Senate Bill 542, and in 2026, your property taxes, you'll have the option of that $400 rebate, that one-time rebate, and then in 2025, and then in 2026, those rates will change again. And so for businesses out there, you should be evaluating right now what your property taxes will look like because of those 2 bills. And oh, by the way, if you have a second property home, say it's a family little place on a river, it's in your favorite hunting area, could be on a lake, those also will have changes in your property rates. And there was a lot of public testimony given by folks about how you could get around that system. If you're a married couple, those are all real problems. And so, the chamber is taking the lead along with the Montana Taxpayers Association in evaluating whether or not those bills are checking all the boxes on legal standing, or whether or not those bills should stand across Montana, because from a property tax standpoint, they shift, and whether or not those shifts are legally done is a question, I think, for the interim to discuss. But just to remind folks, I had to pull out the legislative policy analysis manual on how are property taxes calculated in Montana. And it's market value times your tax rate. That's the taxable value. And a lot of this came up because of 2020s through all these people moving in and driving up the market value. And so when your market value is driven up, you're lowering the tax rate with these bills by the legislature. But the question about taxable value, how much is that really going to go down for people? We're going to see in the next few months. And then, wait, that's not the whole equation, because the next part is you multiply it by the mill levies. And that's decided not by just the legislature, it's decided by school districts, cities, counties, and voters. So that multiplies out, and then you get the amount of taxes that you're paying. And so I think that, yeah, that chart that we all think about in our heads of that complicated structure, is something that for those of us that represent businesses or own businesses, we will all be likely paying more with these two bills. So I won't get into what the minutia was from those. I highly recommend you go to the Montana Chamber website, the Montana Taxpayers Association website, call your CPA. There's a plug to hire a CPA. And I would just say that in the 24 years that I've been lobbying, it was a really difficult conversation. I thought the chamber carried a huge amount of water on it for all of the businesses out there, and I want to commend them for it. It's not an easy task to go up against the governor's office and legislative leadership to some extent when you know it's a really really important discussion, and that people across Montana are being squeezed in their own right on property taxes. And that's why these bills were being brought. So
Yeah.
I'll stop at that because I know there's lots of other thoughts.
Yeah, that's great, Amy. And I think, at the end of the day, what we saw here is we saw a massive property tax shift onto Montana's largest employers, which also happen to be the natural resource industry. And I think it's really ironic that in a state like this here, where you've got so many elected officials campaigning on reviving and bringing back Montana's natural resource industries, we have shifted a massive property tax load onto those folks. Your timber mills, your coal mines, your hard rock mines, your oil and gas, all of those sort of folks are going to see massive property tax increases. And Montana already, before this legislative session, already had one of, if not the most complicated property tax schemes in the entire country. And now we have, by a magnitude of infinity plus one, complicated an already complicated system. So this was really a sore point as we concluded this legislative session. I think we've got a lot of work to do between now and the next session.